All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Daniel. I'm the founder of Startup CPG, and I am excited to be chatting co-manufacturing contracts today with all of you. If you're watching us on YouTube, just make sure to hit subscribe so you know when all of the recordings actually go live. And thank you so much to the Foster Garvey team for bringing all this info. One of the most common questions we get in the Slack is around co-man contracts, and you won't think about it until you find the co-man of your dreams, and then you're trying to work through these agreements. And you're just not going to know the magnitude that some very small language could actually have. And so this is why I'm so grateful that we have the pros here to explain the magnitude to us so that you can hopefully avoid some problems, although you'll definitely have other ones that'll come up. But let's try to make, everybody as well prepared as possible, especially if you haven't done this a ton of times before. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to the Foster Garvey team to please get us started and do an intro also.
All right. I'm Hillary Hughes. I am an attorney with the law firm of Foster Garvey. I'm based in its New York office. We do tons of co-man deals a year. Personally, it's one of my favorite things. I do a lot of different things. I do corporate, other commercial agreements. I do intellectual property, but I have a special place in my heart for co-man arrangements. And the reason I like them so much is because they're very tangible, right? You are hiring an expert to make something tangible that is probably your most important piece of your business as a food or beverage brand. And getting it set up right can make life really easy. Getting it set up not right can make things difficult. And there's a lot of ways to reduce risk, to set the partnership up to be a successful one, and to have a long-standing, very mutually beneficial relationship with a quality vendor. So oftentimes co-manufacturing agreements are the first material contract a brand will have. And so that's often our entry point with a client. They have not used legal support. They've been bootstrapping, kind of, signing contracts on their own and doing things on their own. But everybody in the industry seems to appreciate the importance of the co-manufacturing relationship. And that's oftentimes the first material contract they'll work with an attorney on. So it's one we do a lot of, and we enjoy working with brands on it. Erika, you want to?
Yeah, so I'm Erika Johnson. I'm also based in our New York office. Hillary has pretty much covered it all when it comes to co-man agreements. But yeah, I support our practice in doing all the same things with co-man agreements. So with that, we'll get started.
All right. So there's a lot of pieces to the co-man relationship. And one of them includes sourcing raw materials. And so co-man agreements are often confused with supply agreements. And sometimes the co-man agreement is actually called a supply agreement. I think in most of those instances, the concept is the co-man is supplying a finished good to you. So it's considered a supply, but it's really, if you're being technical and correct, it's not a supply arrangement. It is a manufacturing arrangement. A supply arrangement would more traditionally be with the raw materials vendors that are supplying the raw materials or the packaging. Those are more traditional supply arrangements, although you may hear of a co-manufacturing agreement or arrangement as a supply arrangement. Similarly, relationships with distributors are sometimes called a supply arrangement because the brand is supplying a finished good to a distributor for resale. We tend to call those distribution arrangements, but some people call them supply as well. There are domestic co-mans. I'd say most of the ones we work with are domestic, meaning US-based co-manufacturing partners, but they are also tons of co-manufacturing relationships that are based elsewhere. It could be based elsewhere because it's cheaper to supply and distribute your product in other areas of the world if you produce it elsewhere. Or sometimes your product or your process is so unique that you may need a co-manufacturing partner in another jurisdiction who has that expertise. Sometimes the raw materials you use to produce your product are sourced from another country, so it makes sense to have your co-manufacturer there. And sometimes just the pricing is plain better when you're working with a co-manufacturer in a different location. So there are a lot of different reasons brands may use a foreign or non-US manufacturer, but most of the brands that we work with tend to have a US domestic co-manufacturer because their sales are predominantly in the US, and so that's the most geographic friendly and cost friendly location to have a co-man. Depending on the size of your brand, the volume of your work, we often encourage due diligence on the co-man. Sometimes your budget might not allow deep due diligence on the co-man, but at least some preliminary diligence on the co-man is advised. So understanding whether the co-manufacturer is highly leveraged can tell you something. So sometimes we'll do a lien search on the co-man to see how leveraged it is. Is there a bank or some sort of creditor that has a lien on all of its assets and equipment? Sometimes there's multiple. It'll give you some sense of the financial picture of the co-manufacturer, though many brands have bank loans and liens and they're financially healthy as well. It's just one data point to look at in the larger picture of what's going on with co-manufacturer. We might also do a litigation or judgment search on a co-manufacturer to understand, does it sue a lot of its customers, a lot of its brands when there's a dispute, or there are a lot of disputes? Does it get sued by the brand a lot? Is it getting sued by raw material suppliers or packaging vendors or other vendors in the industry? Can give you a picture of whether this is potentially a problematic partner. So we often do some due diligence on that as well. What is the vendor supplying? In this case, we talked about finished goods. So they're always supplying finished goods, but the question is it, and Erika will get into this a little bit when we get into pricing, is it finished good pricing, turnkey, where you're paying one price for the finished good? It doesn't matter how much the co-manufacturer is spending on purchasing raw materials or ingredients or packaging. Or is it more of a tolling arrangement where you are reimbursing, or you're ordering and sourcing the raw materials and packaging, or you're reimbursing the co-manufacturer for the cost of those and then paying a tolling fee on top of that for their services in processing or producing those raw materials, ingredients into a finished good for you. And the range of things that get sourced and supplied to the co-man, obviously raw materials, ingredients, and packaging, but also could be labels, cartons, inserts, boxes, pallets, other components of the finished good as well. So that all has to be kind of thought through and mapped out. Who's sourcing what? And by sourcing, I mean identifying the supplier, negotiating terms with that supplier of that raw material or ingredient or packaging, arranging for fulfillment, placing orders, the whole process from the point of ordering something to get it incorporated into a finished good. It's always good to describe in the co-manufacturing agreement who's responsible for that. And even if the co-manufacturer has responsibility for it, what approval rights, if any, does the brand have over which raw materials they're picking, what the pricing is for them, which vendors or suppliers are they choosing to source from? So having some specifications on that too is very helpful in making sure you're aligned with the co-manufacturer. Specifications, a very important part. Most co-manufacturers are engaged to produce a product to the brand specifications. So the co-manufacturing agreement almost always includes a specs exhibit or a specs schedule that identifies all of the different components that you want incorporated into and how you want the product produced. This is a sample of some of the things we recommend that the brands we work with include. And I'll tell you a little secret in the trade. We find that lawyers don't look very closely at specifications. So if you can often include something in your specification that gets you some sort of guarantee or assurance from the co-manufacturer that the lawyer for the co-manufacturer might not even look at when negotiating the contract. So we often, I'll give you an example. We had one client that had like a chocolate, think of like a peanut butter cup type product. And in the specifications, they didn't mention anything. We didn't do the co-man agreement. We helped with the dispute with the co-man. So I'll just give that little asterisk. Their specifications were very plain vanilla, that they're like what the ingredients are and how they're supposed to be produced, but not so much about some of the sensory elements that go with the product. So in this instance, the co-man was using a mold to make the cup, the chocolate cup, and they were using some kind of tool and picking them. The workers on the line were picking them with this metal tool out of the mold before packaging them. And in order to to get the leverage to pry the cup out of the mold, the workers who were using gloved hands, right? But they had to hold it and pick it, scoop it out. And there were smudges on the chocolate cups. It like fingerprints, but again, gloved fingerprints. No consumer wants to open their chocolate cup product and see what's clearly a fingerprint smudge or the metal tool etchings in the side of it. But unfortunately, this client didn't have in its specifications that they want a smooth finish on the top of the product. So it became a dispute with the co-man as to whether or not having this smooth finish was part of the co-manufacturer's requirements. So it led to a big dispute. However, if we would have just included some of the sensory elements in the specifications requiring a smooth finish, then it would be clear that this product would be non-conforming, and all the remedies that the brand has for having a non-conforming product would be spelled out in the contract, and then you have clear recourse and you're eliminating disputes that way. And again, putting smooth finish in there, it's unlikely that an attorney on the other side representing the co-manufacturer would call that out or would pay attention to it and say, hey, are you able to get these chocolate cups out of the mold with a smooth finish? It's beyond what your typical lawyer would look at. So it can give you can bake some things into your specifications that will help you prevent disputes and ensure quality of the products that you're getting.
And maybe I'll just add one thing as somebody who ran a brand. I, as a new brand, would have been nervous to ask them for all of this stuff. Like, hey, we're going to put all this in there. But like, actually, I was really surprised that the co-man was like, yeah, we can test all of this. It's pretty standard for us. We can test the pH during this part of the process and later. And I would say when you're talking to a co-man, the easiest, when you have the most leverage is if you can say, this is out of spec. Here are the specifications. You tested it. Your own testing shows that it is out of spec. Otherwise, they typically have a lot more leverage than you have because your product's in their hands. You need to have it out in market. But a product that is clearly defined outside of the specifications that they owe it to you to produce in, that's where you really have this contract on your side. So I really love that just that you've shown all the stuff here. And I would encourage brands, do not be afraid to just give them all the specs in the world. And they'll like it too. The co-mans will appreciate having all of that stuff. They don't want to smudge your product if you're going to reject it, right? So that's a good thing to communicate to them.
Yeah, they typically like the specs because it tells them what they need to do and helps them evaluate whether they're the right partner and they can produce the product. And for you, it's a quality control issue, and it prevents or minimizes disputes.
We've also found adding specs for materials and packaging has been equally helpful, because again, it just is more guardrails and guidelines, in a similar sense to specs for finished product.
And we have a co-man in the audience, Rob, who said, as a co-man, the more specs, the better. So heard it there first. All right.
So we'll try to not disparage co-men.
They are your
since
friends.
we have
They're
a
your
mixed
partners.
audience.
Yeah. For sure.
Facility location. Is this mine, Erika? I don't have my list in front of me. Is
Yep.
this okay? So obviously where the co-man is located is very important to you for a variety of reasons, the most important of which is distribution strategy and reducing cost. If you can afford it, and as you grow, we generally recommend having at least 2 co-men. We say co-man, but it's not really a plural, but we suggest that you have multiple ones. One, for redundancy. If something happens at one co-man, they have a force majeure event or something happens, you have another co-man that you could ramp up, ideally, to produce the excess volume. You could locate them, or you could select co-man that are in different geographic locations, maybe a West Coast, an East Coast, somewhere in the center of the country, and reduce your distribution costs that way. And it's also good to have a little competition, right? Competition generally makes for better services or better product. So a co-man, knowing that you've got another co-man that could be doing a better job and get more of your business is also good as well. So, and then of course, your co-man is a key relationship that you're going to want to visit a lot, visit on the floor, see how the line's running, just understand what they're doing, how they're storing, whether it's finished goods or your raw materials. It's just good to have access to your manufacturer as probably your most important vendor. So knowing where they are and that you could get to them fairly quickly is important in deciding where to find a co-man as well.
Right. So development, customization, testing, and trial runs. This is sort of the little brother precursor to co-man agreements. We often recommend this as a separate agreement, and it's often a much more limited, shorter, sometimes simpler agreement to a manufacturing agreement. Often we see this as a way to develop a new formulation, new product, maybe test out a new manufacturer or test out a new relationship with a potential co-manufacturer. So this will sometimes be a short-term agreement, or maybe on a production run by production run basis. Maybe it's a one-off run, something like that. So, because it's usually a little bit, shorter term, compensation can range from a fixed fee. So, maybe it's just one production run. So it's just one, simple fee, or it can be hourly. So if it's a production run by production run, maybe it's an 8-hour production run and you just bill it by the hour. If you do that, make sure you define what a production run actually is going to be. So that way your 8-hour production run doesn't turn into a 12 or 15-hour production run to get whatever your volume of product is completed. Because then you might have really, really expensive product. Let's see. Sometimes the compensation might be a chance to win business. So if the production run goes well, or the testing of a new relationship, new product, new formulation turns out really well, then you guys will move into a larger, more expansive agreement, and it'll be a full co-manufacturing agreement. So that's something we see relatively often. Especially in the testing of a new relationship or new product, new formulation type of sense. So also often when you're testing a new product or a new formulation, one of the big questions that we will always ask, will you be marketing or selling or testing this new product or sampling this product at like expos? If that is the case, we really need to talk about reps, warranties, safety standards, and put in some of like the usual types of guardrails that we would in a regular co-man agreement. So, your products need to be manufactured just as they would if you were going to sell it, on the normal, marketplace. Whether it's a cosmetic or a food product, you need to make sure that it's safe and meets standards. Because that's not always something that's included in a testing agreement. And then probably the biggest issue that is not always covered, not always thought about in testing agreements because they are so short term and sometimes are just one pagers, is intellectual property ownership. As a brand, you want to make sure that you are the owner of your IP, particularly if you are developing a new product, a new formula, you're testing out a new relationship with a co-man and you're not sure what their standard approach is to IP ownership. You really need to make sure you drill down into the IP ownership provisions and that you are owning everything that you've brought to the table, anything that you are developing with the co-manufacturer, anything that's being developed for you, to make sure that what is the core of your business remains yours.
Yeah, and Erika, maybe just a quick note on an NDA is not the same as a testing and trial agreement. We see this a lot where a brand decides to try out a co-man, and so they'll do some trial runs or some testing with nothing but an NDA in place. And thankfully for the NDA, that's great. You definitely want an NDA. But what the NDA doesn't cover is some of these things that Erika went over. Whether if you're going to, the trial products or the testing, the samples that come out of the trial runs, are they going to be sold? And if they are, they're going to be consumed by consumers, you need some, some quality assurance, some safety assurance guarantees behind that from the co-manufacturer. And then the IP ownership, so that's not the safety of what they're producing is not addressed in an NDA. And as Erika said, IP ownership is not addressed in an NDA. So if the co-man is testing or trialing your product and they suggest some changes, you might want to try using this ingredient instead. It performs better. I mean, co-mans are a wealth of knowledge. And so they've seen a lot and they can make suggestions about process changes or ingredient changes, packaging changes, even a lot of ideas and suggestions on how to potentially modify or improve the product or improve the process. And the default rule in intellectual property is that the person who creates it or comes up with it or suggests the improvement or the change owns it, absent a written agreement. So if you just have an NDA in place and you don't have a co-man agreement in place yet because you haven't decided to go with this co-man, if you don't have the trial or testing agreement in place that deals with IP and ownership of any of the improvements, the NDA is not going to cover you on that, and the co-man will own that by default without it being covered in the agreement. Now, can you fix that after the fact in the co-manufacturing agreement? Yes, you can fix that. But if the co-man that you're testing with and trialing with suggests an improvement, but for whatever other reason you don't go with that co-man, you couldn't reach agreement on pricing, don't get along, whatever it is, then you don't own that improvement they suggested. So we always recommend, again, it doesn't have to be a dissertation in length, but you want some sort of trial or testing agreement in place to cover IP ownership and sort of the quality and safety if the samples from the trial run are going to be given or sold to consumers.
And I'll just add, for anyone who does a trial run, we did one once where they were like, yeah, we don't want to get into that, but just put not for sale on the label, and then we don't care what you do with it. If you're just doing like a couple hundred cans or something, or units for a trade show, you could decide if you want to risk it that way. But yeah, probably you wouldn't want to risk anything going to consumers, I'm sure. Not a lawyer. Don't take my advice.
All right, Hillary, I'll hand it back to you.
All right. So, and I think I saw a question in the chat about this. So somebody's going to get their question answered. What happens if, I think their question was, what happens if the co-man doesn't want an agreement or is not willing to have an agreement? We call that the skittish co-man. We have three, this is how it plays out in our practice. We have three different forms of co-manufacturing agreement that we start from. We have like the light version, which is for the skittish co-man. It's very kind of dumbed down to the most important terms and doesn't have a lot of fluff or a lot of detail. And then we have a medium one, which is the one we end up using the most often. And then we have a more robust one for brands that have more leverage or bargaining power with the co-manufacturer. But it's better to get something in writing. Purchase orders, and I think this was in the person's question as well, just going with purchase orders. Purchase orders, it depends on whose purchase order is. Is it the co-man's form? Is it your form? And if it's your form, are you putting in some basic terms on it that will help you in the event of a dispute? Clear responsibilities of the co-man that you could hold them to. We generally suggest even going with a light version of an agreement rather than just relying on purchase orders. Purchase orders don't get looked at in detail, typically, other than the quantity, the date, you know, the variety, the mix of SKUs, but not so much for contract terms. So I don't feel like they've got the same quality control on, you know, the binding legal terms that a formal agreement would have. And verbal agreements are also not helpful if there's ever a problem. And by problem, I mean usually a quality or safety issue with the co-man. Could be pricing dispute or something like that. But having a written agreement that sort of spells out how those things are going to be handled is just the better way to go. Keep in mind, you know, everybody contracts the process. It takes a while. People think of it as a headache and as an additional spend. I always think of it as an investment, right? Because you're investing in reducing risk if there's ever a problem, a safety problem for consumers. You're ensuring quality. And to be honest with you, when you get to the point where you're raising capital, most investors want to see that you've put a written agreement in place with your most important vendor, which is your manufacturer. So they're going to be looking for that in diligence. So it is a good investment to get a solid agreement in place. What it signals to the investor is that you care about the business. You're going to be a good steward of their money to make sure that you're documenting the contract terms. You've got recourse if there's a problem. It's just really a good thing to put in place. It's really an investment in saving some headache and making investors more comfortable and making you more attractive to investors. And then, of course, down the road, acquirers, as you're growing, are going to want to see what assurances you've gotten from your co-man about the quality of the products, because there's usually a time period post-acquisition before the larger business that has acquired your business is able to fully incorporate manufacturing your products into their existing manufacturing infrastructure. So there's going to be some overlap there where they're inheriting that co-manufacturing relationship for a particular period of time.
Exclusivity. So this is not always an advantageous term to have, but it is often something that we will find brands will push for. So if it is going to be a term that we include, we will urge brands to make sure it's carefully tailored to specific products, territories, channels, so on and so forth, just to make sure that it's not, overbroad, and does not end up, you know, uh, overly limiting the brand in ways like, making sure that, it doesn't limit their ability to source inventory, or, cap their ability to source volume, and so on. So, for example, if a brand has exclusivity obligations, meaning they are exclusive to one co-manufacturer for a particular product or for all of their product needs, they may not be able to source sufficient product volume if that co-manufacturer is unable to keep up with their volume needs. Say they onboard a new account, something like Costco, and all of a sudden their volume requirements skyrocket. So, we'll try to make sure that the exclusivity is adequately tailored, or that there is, sort of release valves in the event that, brands needs change. So, maybe we'll add a carve out for new volume requirements, or if Coman has a shortfall in volume or non-conforming products, or there's a pricing disagreement, force majeure, other breaches of that nature that would allow a brand to, exit the exclusive relationship. On the flip side, vendor will not, the vendor side, co-man side will not often enter into an exclusive relationship where they are the only co-manufacturer for brand, and to the exclusion of manufacturing for other brands. So, they won't manufacture for competitive brands, because that would inherently mean that they are foreclosing on other business for themselves. And so it's not something that we will often see. Sometimes we will end up seeing this sort of term in the instance that brand does not own their own intellectual property, but the co-manufacturer does, and might have the opportunity to manufacture a competitive product. That's pretty much the only instance that I think I've seen recently where this term has been negotiated. But again, it's pretty narrowly tailored to a particular, territory, channel, mix of products, to make sure that it's fair to both the co-manufacturer and the brand, just to make sure that both sides are benefiting from the exclusivity, and that nobody is shackled too heavily by the term. And as we've got up here, we'll want to make sure that exclusivity sunsets if there is any sort of reason, such as there's volume or new need for purchasing, that sort of thing. So, I don't know, anything else I missed, Hillary?
I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to get exclusivity on the vendor side, as Erika said. It's very hard because most co-mans specialize in a type of product, and if they're going to give you exclusivity on it, then they're foreclosing other business. So you typically have to have a large volume of business for them to make it worth their while to grant you exclusivity. And on the brand side, this is requested a lot. We try like heck to not have to give it because it can be very limiting. And to my point earlier about the desirability of redundancy and having multiple co-men for geographic efficiency, or if there's a problem with one and you can ramp up at another, it's hard or impossible to do that if you're giving the co-manufacturer an exclusive.
So pricing, generally speaking, pricing for co-man arrangements will either be turnkey or tolling. So turnkey is often referring to a relationship where the co-manufacturer is purchasing all of your materials, packaging, so on and so forth, and producing your final product for you. It's an all-in pricing structure. Whereas tolling, the brand will bring materials to a facility and then is only paying a pricing structure for use of the facility, and labor, that sort of thing. Basically, they are renting out the facility and expertise of the co-manufacturer to produce their product. Depending on sort of the expertise needed, or the difficulty in sourcing products, or just the brand's needs for sourcing and assistance in getting their product made. Turnkey versus tolling may be better for a brand in different instances. Sometimes brands will have some co-man partners that are turnkey, some that are tolling. Sometimes brands will elect to have all turnkey, all tolling. It just depends. Let's see, shipping. Sometimes shipping will be built into your pricing structure. Sometimes it will be separate from. It will just depend on, again, what works best for the parties, and what your shipping terms are. So if you are picking your product up, then that should be the brand's cost. If you're picking your stuff up and you're doing all of your own shipping, then you shouldn't be paying the co-man to do that for you. But if the co-man is doing all of your shipping for you, then sure, that'll be built into the cost of your product. Oftentimes you will see a minimum purchase obligation, whether that's a per purchase order or an annual minimum. Oftentimes we'll see a little bit of confusion on the brand side or the co-man side between these two terms, and how they kind of play together. So we often have to take a little bit of time to explain those two. So for the annual minimum, that is how much a brand will have to purchase in a year, or how much a co-man will have to produce and sell to a brand in a year. That can be a super advantageous term for both parties, because then everybody knows how much is expected of them, or how much they will be producing in a year. So that is a guaranteed supply for a brand. That's guaranteed business for a co-man. Whereas the minimum order obligation for a PO, it has a similar purpose, but that's on a much smaller scale. And that can be really helpful for smaller scale operations, like ordering your materials. You'll know on a rolling basis how much say like flour or your consumables that you'll need to order on a consistent basis, or how much line time you'll need to fulfill purchase orders. So take or pay penalty that we've got up there. If those minimums are not met, oftentimes there is a penalty for the brand side. And take or pay refers to either you take or you purchase the full MOQ, or full annual minimum, whichever one we're talking about, or you pay a penalty for not doing so. And that is to reimburse the co-manufacturer for the materials or lost profits on the volume that they otherwise would have produced for you. and that you promised to purchase. We try not to have that be too hefty of a price for brand because, we don't want to have too heavy of a cost for brand. But at the same time, there has to be, some sort of, recognition that if you don't purchase what it is you promised to purchase, there is some cost involved there. On the flip side, we often will see a penalty for co-manufacturer shortfall. So if they don't actually produce what they've promised to produce, whether on a purchase order by purchase order basis or on an annual basis, there will be a similar penalty received. So sort of flowing right into the same thing, volume discounts. Oftentimes if a brand purchases a certain threshold volume, they will receive a discount that is often tied back to co-man or brand. Whoever is doing your material purchasing will receive discounts for purchasing materials in certain bulk amounts, or it's just cheaper to produce your product at bulk amounts when you're running your line more efficiently. Price fluctuations, market conditions. Oftentimes we will see built into agreements, and we will suggest built into agreements that there is a pricing fluctuation or market conditions type of provision. So that way, if there is a material change in any sort of input cost, that there is a way for the parties to renegotiate and adjust pricing in an agreeable way. We usually have this tied back to a market, metric, something like CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So that way there's a, hard and fast metric that, is not, just a number that the one party or the other can just, decide on and make a pricing change or pricing adjustment unconscionable for the other. We will often try to build into agreements as well that if a pricing change is, too high, too much, not feasible, especially for brand, that there is a, right to termination, whether on a SKU by SKU basis for services or overall, because sometimes even for price fluctuations in the market, out of both parties' control, you just can't make a product if it's too expensive anymore. And nobody can control that. And then as far as payment terms for disputes and early pay, oftentimes co-man vendors will really appreciate if you pay your bills early. And so we will oftentimes find if we put an early pay term in there, we can sometimes get brands a little bit of a discount. And so for brands that have that ability to do so, sometimes co-man will give a little, few percentage points off on, invoices. Sometimes not, but always fun to try. And then for disputed invoices, we will always put in a term that for any good faith disputes, so say there's non-conforming products that a brand receives, any amount that is in dispute will not be an outstanding amount that is subject to, interest rate or, anything like that, while that amount is being disputed.
I'm just adding because there's a pretty lively chat going on in the chat section about like, I need this kind of comment. Hey, I've got this. And also, so Hillary mentioned a very nice offer, which is sometimes they will actually just give you a list that they happen to have, which is not super vetted. But if anybody needs help with that, I just pasted their emails. We're going to get to their contact info at the end. But if you are somebody who wants to talk to the Foster Garvey team, whether it's about just getting that list or about help with a contract for a co-man, I just dropped both of their emails into the chat. So back, just interrupting to say that, but back to you guys.
Perfect. All right. Anything else on pricing and invoicing before I move on to the next slide, Hillary. Okay. All right, so certifications, audits, and reports. So certifications, we can have both facility-based and product-based certifications. There's a lot of overlap between the two. So facility certifications, you'll have things like SQF, so safety quality food, HACCP certifications, BRC, so British Retail Consortium. And those are more along your, safety certifications. You can have, marketing quality certifications, so things like the GFCO, so gluten-free certification, non-GMO, organic, that sort of thing. And some of the overlap with product certifications, similarly non-GMO, gluten-free, so on and so forth. And those are third-party certifications, and those will speak to the safety, quality, certain marketing aspects that you may want to use to attract certain demographics of consumers to purchase your products. And then for audits and inspections, you'll have both third-party audits and agency audits and inspections. So for some of the third-party audits and inspections, those will tie in almost directly to the certifications that you may need or want for your products. So if you have certain marketing claims, some of those third-party certifications may require a specific third-party audit in order to keep that certification. But then certain agencies, FDA, USDA, may require an audit or inspection, on an annual, biannual basis, and so on, depending on the type of product that is being produced or processed in the facility. And so depending on the agreement that you have with the co-man, sometimes the certifications or audits, especially the third-party audits, that may be at your cost, that may be at the co-manufacturer's cost. Kind of just depends on whose purpose you're getting it for. If there's other customers of the co-man perhaps that want the same certifications, all just depends. Those are all up for negotiation. Of course, if possible, if we're representing brand, we will try to have the co-man pay for and take responsibility for maintaining certifications. If we're representing co-man, then the shoe's on the other foot. But regardless, brand should have the right to review and access information about any of the audits, food safety information, certifications, production data, all of that goes into the manufacture of their products, because all of that information is really important, especially in this day and age of transparency and end user consumers wanting transparency into how their food's made, how their food is marketed, how their food's labeled, so on and so forth. But also too, as a brand, a lot of that information and data is really important as you are figuring out costing, manufacturing, all of that information. And
I'm just gonna just interrupt. Probably we need to speed up a little bit because I know we have a lot of slides to still get through in just about 10 minutes before a lot of people have to jump. One thing I wanted to highlight, so somebody had asked in the chat here, what's the typical price range if you want to work with someone like Foster Garvey on an agreement? And Hillary had put in here, if it's not too complicated, typically they can help you with a first draft for like $2,500 to $3,500. So probably that'll be interesting to people to know about. And again, I put their contact info in the chat. But yeah, maybe we can try to accelerate the
Thanks, Dan. I answered that privately.
Sorry. My bad. Zip. Someone edit that out.
Okay, so related to certifications and so on, often testing is tied right into that. Usually your agreements, and honestly, your agreements should talk to safety and quality testing. Again, this is something that'll be agreed to by the parties, should also appear in your specifications. So things like microbiological testing, water activity, pH, allergen testing, those are kind of the usual minimum types of things. So sampling of in-process, products on the production line, finished goods. Samples should be taken for every single production run. Spot samples for all finished product for every single PO, and products should be held, anywhere from 1 to 3 years, but at least until after shelf life is complete. And whether it's included in pricing and who's paying for the testing, that will be up to the negotiation of the parties. But often it will be included in your pricing, especially if it's turnkey. And especially if it's related to safety, quality, conformity to specifications. But if there's any sort of additional or extra, testing that's not already agreed to by the parties, that will be, at brand's extra cost. All right, back to you, Hillary.
All right, forecasting always an important part of the relationship. Obviously, the brand's going to want the forecasting to be non-binding. A middle ground is having a certain portion of it be binding, a short-term portion of the forecast be binding. And there's a negotiation about what period of time the forecast should cover. Do you have to forecast for a full year, a quarter, a month, 6 months? So this is all part of negotiation and planning and making sure it works for you. And the binding forecast, really, we want it to be binding both directions. If they're going to require that the brand's forecast be binding, then you want guaranteed supply, right? The co-man has to produce at least up to that forecast, with potentially, a flex plus 20% or something that's typically negotiated. So it should go kind of both ways. Is this me too? Fulfillment, obviously an important term of the co-manufacturing relationship. You need to understand what kind of lead time the co-manufacturer will need so that you can plan when to submit your POs and when you're going to need and receive the product. You want to figure out, does the co-man have the right to accept POs, or do they have to fulfill any POs that are submitted? Going back to the guaranteed supply concept, can there be changes or cancellation of a PO? Of what period of time? Can you do it the day before it's produced, or do you need to cancel with a longer lead time? Can the co-man cancel or change a purchase order? So these are all things that should be spelled out. One of the benefits of having a written agreement. Guaranteed supply. I'm going to skip the case study since we're short on time. We like to give some real life examples of things that have happened, but since we're short on time, I'll skip it. Guaranteed supply is probably the most important thing in your co-manufacturing relationship, because if you don't have product, you're going to get discoed somewhere. So you need a clear line of supply and commitments from the co-man to fulfill your orders in the lead time you need it. Loss allowance is something we typically negotiate. This is how much waste the co-man can have on the line. As a general rule, if it's a thick viscous product or solid product, there's usually larger amount of waste than there is with a liquid, like a beverage or a very clear liquid product. You want a lower loss allowance. And the concept of loss allowance is simply that amount can be wasted without the co-man having to pick up the tab for it. If it's exceeded, then the co-man needs to give some sort of reimbursement, discount, price adjustment for wasted raw materials, ingredients, or packaging.
Title risk of loss. So you'll have to think about risk of loss and title for your materials, your work in process, and your finished products. And this will differ for each of these things depending on which party is sourcing and purchasing, and what your fulfillment and shipping terms are. So for example, if your co-man is sourcing and purchasing all of your materials, then your co-man will probably want to and should be holding title and have the risk of loss for all of your materials. Similarly, depending on what your shipment terms are, which may be Incoterms, like FOB facility, title and risk of loss of your finished goods will transfer to the brand once finished product is loaded onto the brand's common carrier and shipped. So it'll just really depend on who is holding title to whichever asset we're talking about from the start, and where the product is going, who's going to be owning it, and really where risk of loss should be. As a general rule, though, if a asset is at the facility of the co-man's facility and they are in control of it, they should be the ones with risk of loss, holding risk of loss, because they are in control of the asset. That is what we often try to push for. Let's see, and then for liens on product, we always try to avoid allowing a co-manufacturer from putting a lien on any product or material, especially because oftentimes brands will have loans, or they will have creditors, and often they will need to get permission or consent from their creditors before they are allowed to have a third party place a lien or use their assets or finished products as collateral. Because that would be primary to some of their creditors' rights. But also too, you don't want your finished products to be used or disappear from you before you're allowed to sell them and make revenue off of them. All right, back to you, Hillary.
All right, this is a super important concept. You want to make sure that the co-man has an obligation to inspect materials when they arrive. So if it's raw materials or packaging, usually you want to set a short period of time, 24 hours, 48, maybe 72 if the co-man's really pushy, to make sure that they inspect them and agree that they're conforming to whatever the specs are for the raw materials or packaging that they need to produce the product. Doing this creates a clear demarcation of liability if there is a problem with an ingredient or packaging. If the co-man has to inspect it and advise you of any problems with it, and they within a certain period of time, and they don't, then we always put that it's deemed conforming. That prevents the finger pointing scenario when there's a problem and the co-man says, oh, that's a problem with the raw materials, the ingredients, that we didn't do anything wrong in processing it. This can save a lot of headaches. So you always want an obligation to inspect and accept or deem acceptance if there's if they haven't told you about a problem.
So just heads up to everyone, because we're hitting 4 o'clock now Eastern. If anyone has to run, I'm just gonna let us run through as long as Hillary and Erika want to go, because we have this basically section on like what happens when things go wrong or there's non-conformance in the contract. So I want to get to these slides. If anybody has to leave, we'll have the recording out. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. It'll alert you when it goes live, and we will be emailing out the slides, because there are I think 6 or 7 more that we're going to try to get to here about what to do when things go wrong. So we'll just let it run. And then also, if you want to follow up with them, and again, I'll just post their emails one more time here, but back to you guys.
I realized I forgot one piece on the acceptance. There's also the brand's obligation to inspect and accept the finished goods when they're delivered or picked up from the co-man. Many co-mans will push for this. We try to resist it, but if we do have it, you have to figure out what makes sense. When are you going to be able to do your inspection? And unfortunately, unlike raw materials that come in large, containers, finished goods are individually packaged, right? And sometimes they're, wrapped in pallet and prostograph and all that good stuff. So it's hard to inspect every single one. Sometimes you do some spot checks, but really what you can't tell from an inspection as the brand and the recipient of the finished good is everything right inside it, and across all, is it made correctly? Is the whole lot conforming? And so it's very hard to commit to that. So there can be what's called latent defects or latent nonconformances that you might not know until a consumer buys the product. And for example, in the chocolate instance I gave you, and it has a thumbprint on it, you're not going to necessarily know that until the consumer calls and complains to you and puts a bunch of bad reviews online. So you want to carve out from that obligation what we call latent defects. Those are ones that are not obvious, but that will present themselves later, and you don't want the co-man to not have an obligation to stand behind the quality and safety of their product post acceptance of it. So this is something that's very important to make sure you build into the contract. Is this me, Erika? So what is your recourse when the co-man provides you with non-conforming goods? There's a variety of things that we typically include. You can reject them and require the co-man to redo a new run and provide you with conforming product. The problem with that, of course, is additional delay. If you didn't get the non-conforming batch until the date you needed it, and now, oh my God, they have to rerun it. So we usually require them to do it on an expedited basis. We often require them to do it for free or negotiate a reduced rate. We have them pick up shipping for it or delivery. All these penalties serve as a disincentive to the co-manufacturer to produce non-conforming goods. Sometimes if you're going to be late on orders and a customer is going to cancel the order, we try and get, kind of your lost revenue from that canceled order. If they can't make it fast enough and you have to go get it produced by your secondary co-man, and let's say your secondary co-man's a little more expensive, we will have build in that the co-man has to pay for the difference in price. So there's a variety of avenues for recourse, that this is all part of the negotiation.
Confidentiality is a huge piece that has to be, paid attention to, negotiated. So first, sort of piece that we look at is whether or not there's an NDA already in place. If there is, we'll take a look at whether or not the NDA is properly tailored to the co-man relationship. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. If it's not, then we will often just put a new and better tailored confidentiality provision into the co-man agreement. Second line question is whether or not the confidentiality obligation should be mutual or if it should just be one-sided. If we can, and we're representing the brand, we will try to only have the co-man have confidentiality obligations, because conceivably brand is the one sharing their confidential information. Usually the co-man is not sharing information back to the brand. Sometimes that isn't really something that a co-man would agree to. So sometimes we end up having to put mutual obligations in there. But if a brand does not have to take on obligations to keep confidential information or information that a co-man might share back to them, confidential, then great, that keeps down administrative burden. But sort of the next consideration is making sure that the definition of confidential information is well tailored. And that might include the valuable key information that brand is going to be sharing, so recipes, maybe specifications, other trade secret information, basically the stuff that's going to be core to brand's business and brand's value. We're also concerned about making sure that there are confidentiality obligations in place for any of the representatives or employees, contractors, or other third parties that might have access to confidential information under the co-man agreement. So, whether that's written or, at least as restrictive as the confidentiality obligations that we are placing on the co-man, or if it's mutual on both parties, to make sure that, say, an employee of the co-man has access to the recipes or the specifications, that they too are required to maintain confidentiality. And so one of the, last and final, like very big considerations is whether or not brand has restrictions or if they are allowed to share confidential information about the manufacturing relationship or the agreement as a whole with their current or prospective investors, acquirers, insurers, and so on. Because if they are thinking of doing a capital raise or perhaps they're looking to exit, and the co-manufacturing relationship is a key one to their business, they need to be able to share details about that relationship with anybody looking to invest in their business or acquire their business.
This is me. All right, IP ownership. We've talked a little bit about this in the testing and trial agreement context, but there's often confusion about NDAs and IP ownership. So NDAs typically take a snapshot of who owns what IP and confidential information at the time the parties are entering into the relationship, but they typically don't go into newly created IP or changed IP improvements, modifications that happen as part of the relationship. So you need to cover that in the co-manufacturing agreement. The NDA is not going to deal with newly created IP and rights to it. So it's going to be, a question of who owns what. It's fairly standard for the brand to own the recipe and formulation. It's a trade secret typically. Trade secrets are protected not via registration like a copyright or trademark or patent is, but via keeping it confidential. So those are typically easy unless it's the co-man's recipe and formulation and you haven't negotiated or paid for ownership of it. Process IP is a little more complicated. Co-man all think that they're special and they've got their special way of doing things. But if your product has a specific process that you came to them with, and there's something proprietary or unique about it, then you should really own that part of the process. So you need to take a close look at process and figure out whether it's yours, it's theirs, or there's some sort of mutual rights to it, particularly if you're developing a new process with them. So this is not, you shouldn't be overlooked. Improvements and changes we talked about. Co-man, as we said, are very resourceful and see a lot. And so they often suggest improvements or changes to your recipe, your formulation, your process. You need to identify who owns that. If you're a brand, then typically you want to own it. And if the co-man is using anything of their own that's proprietary, you want to make sure you get a broad enough license to that so you can go to another co-man and replicate it, or so that when you get acquired in an exit, that the acquirer will have rights to use that. Even if the co-man owns it, you need to negotiate a license for it. So there can be a lot of back and forth on this. You also want to prohibit the co-manufacturer from taking a third party, another brand's IP, and unknowingly to you, them incorporating it into your product, because that can cause some problems and you could potentially find yourself with an infringement or a trade secret misappropriation claim. So you want to actively prohibit that in the agreement so that the co-man doesn't get you in trouble, and you want to make sure you have an indemnity for it if it does. Trademarks, of course, your products are going to bear your trademark, your brand on it. You want to make sure you own that. We have had a situation where a client did not register its own trademark, and the co-man went and registered it, and the client only discovered years later that the co-man had registered it and tried to claim ownership of it on their own. So you just need to be careful and make sure you own all the marks, the slogans, the product descriptions that you use for your product and your brand.
Insurance, everybody's favorite topic. So you'll need to make sure that the co-man's insurance covers all of the appropriate different topics, and that coverage is appropriate and sufficient in limit amount. So examples of that, you'll want to make sure that the policies cover brands products, co-man's products, materials, anything owned by brand and co-man. So, examples of types of appropriate coverage that we would expect to see, it would be general commercial liability, contamination, seizure, recall, market withdrawal coverage, product liability, equipment insurance, property damage, bodily injury, and personal injury coverage, maybe property, like real property, casualty injury, workers' comp, those sorts of insurance policies. Often we will see that there is, or we will require actually, that there are limits in the aggregate and per occurrence basis. And depending on the size of the co-man, type of relationship, what you are producing, all of that, the range of coverage limit will differ. So it's a little bit hard to, give you an actual range of, how much insurance you should have. It's not unusual for a co-man to also ask that a brand have insurance in place as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is a return request. Although we, of course, when we're representing brand, we'll try to only have the co-man contractually required to maintain insurance. Let's see. We will also look to have brand named as an additional insured on the brand on the co-man's insurance. We'll look to include endorsements on the co-man's insurance, that their insurance will be primary and brand's insurance will be non-contributory. So brand's insurance will cover the claim first, and brand's insurance will not be required to contribute to the cost of covered claims. And another important thing that we always ask for is proof of the coverage that we are requiring a co-manufacturer to have. And that might come by way of a certificate of insurance, which is just a little one page that says what a co-manufacturer has as their insurance, and that will include all the endorsements on there. But we also have gotten in the habit of asking for a copy of the insurance policies. And that, no pun intended, is extra insurance that they actually have the insurance they say they have. We will also ask that a co-manufacturer keep their insurance in place for 30 days after the termination or expiration of a agreement to make sure that any obligations that extend beyond the term of the agreement will also be covered by that insurance. And are we covering any sort of case studies?
I think briefly.
Okay.
We can.
Yeah. So 2 case studies here. We had one yogurt brand where the co-manufacturer had insurance in place. There were some materials in the co-man's facility that were lost due to fire. And unfortunately, the co-manufacturer's insurance did not cover the costs of those destroyed materials. And so the brand ended up having to make a claim against its own insurance policies for the damaged and destroyed materials. And it was a pretty expensive endeavor for the brand, which could have been entirely avoided for the brand if the co-manufacturer had had the correct and sufficient coverage in place. Second case study was for a trail mix brand. I believe this brand was actually manufacturing in-house, but this instance, they had a leak in their roof at the facility, and that resulted in some damage and I think full destruction of some materials and finished product, and some of the equipment they had on one of their production lines. And they did have insurance, but it unfortunately was only for real estate, covered the building itself, damage to the building. And so it did not cover any sort of claims related to anything inside of the building. So it covered the damage that led to the leak in the roof, but nothing that was damaged by the leak. So again, it was a pretty expensive scenario for them, and all the costs of the lost and damaged materials, finished product, and equipment were out of pocket for them, which anyone who's purchased a production line knows that's expensive. Larry, to you.
Okay, we're getting into the really sexy stuff now. Limitations on liability. These are the types of provisions you probably see in contracts and glaze over because this is the stuff of purely lawyers, but it's super important. Most co-mans will try and include what's called a limitation of liability, and they try and bar specific types of damages. They put a cap on their liability. This is where they try to mitigate their own risk for their own, errors under the contract. Usually they draft it as unilateral, meaning it only benefits them. One of the first things we do if a brand is being required to give a limitation of liability is make it mutual so that you also benefit from a limitation on your liability. The dollar amount is super important. If there is a true health or safety issue with a food product or beverage product that a human is consuming, the liability could be significant. So capping it at a low amount is going to leave you without full recourse if there is a massive issue. And then there needs to be carve-outs from it. For example, intellectual property infringement, if the co-man steals your IP, there is a very little dollar amount that's going to make you whole for that. So if it's capped or maxed out, I kind of look at it as it's almost an option for the co-man to buy your IP for whatever the cap is. So let's say you have a $1 million limitation of liability, and that includes IP infringement. Theoretically, the co-man could say, oh, well, I'm going to steal this great recipe or formulation or process, and I'm going to use it for myself, make a bunch of money on it, or give it to a bunch of other brands. And my max liability for that is $1 million. I'll make tons more than that on it than I will paying this brand $1 million. So it almost becomes a purchase right for your IP. So we carve out IP infringement. We try to carve out health and safety issues. So what we call indemnification claims, consumers get hurt. We carve out confidentiality breaches. It's the same thing, very similar to IP infringement. If somebody leaks your sensitive confidential information, a dollar amount is probably not going to make you whole. So it's an important part of your contract to care about. It's just, tee your lawyers up on it and have your lawyers negotiate it and work with you on what's appropriate there or not. But don't just glaze over them because they're very important.
Okay, force majeure. Another super fun lawyer section. This has become much more popular, especially since the pandemic, because this was a provision much more exercised post-pandemic. So this, if there is something that occurs outside of the control of the parties, a party can declare a force majeure event, basically saying like, hey, I can't perform because, XYZ thing happened, making my performance impossible. And so we will want to make sure that the, force majeure conditions or things that a party can say, leads to a force majeure event are well defined and appropriately defined. So using COVID as an example, we'll want to say a force majeure event for COVID can only be called for, a government mandate or, something that a governmental authority has put in place, but it can't be a self-imposed limitation or just the general economic effects of COVID, limiting a party's, ability to perform under the agreement, something of that nature. And so we'll want to make sure that, the things that can lead to force majeure are not overly broad. And so let's say a force majeure event is called. The party that declares a force majeure event is generally obligated to minimize the impact that declaring an event on the other party has. So, for example, if a co-man declares force majeure, they might have to allocate their resources in a way that does not disproportionately impact one customer over another. So they might need to allocate equipment, facilities, materials, labor, so on and so forth. So that way, customer A is not prioritized over customer B. And that might look like, you get 50% of your product manufactured rather than 0% of your product manufactured while somebody else gets 100% of their product manufactured. Let's see. So we also will try to negotiate certain obligations to be waived. So, think back to the MOQ or annual minimum obligations. We will sometimes get those reduced or removed entirely from an agreement if there is a force majeure event called. Or sometimes we'll have like an interest accrual on overdue payments waived, especially if they remain overdue during a force majeure event. And then probably one of the biggest ones that we will put in is if a force majeure event lasts for longer than a specified period, so maybe it's 3 months, then, the non-calling party, so in the example we just gave, brand will have the right to terminate the agreement without, whatever other penalties might otherwise normally exist in the agreement. So, for example, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, brand might not be required to purchase back all of their materials, or they might not have their take or pay penalty on, their annual minimum or MOQ, or if there's exclusivity in the agreement. There might not be a tail period after termination that they have to remain exclusive or not manufacture whatever the exclusive product is with another manufacturer. So those are some of the remedies to force majeure.
All right, I'm just going to highlight, we're going to get booted in about 5 minutes. So I know we have just, I think, 3 slides left to cover if we can try to speed through those.
Yep. All right, Heather.
All right, since most brands are building to be acquired, right? That's their goal. Some brands are building to produce a profitable business to, pass down for generations to generations, but most of the time brands are building towards an exit. So you don't want to have a situation where your co-manufacturer can veto an exit. So you want to pay careful attention to the assignment clauses. This is in the back. It's in the miscellaneous section, the boilerplate, the places where only lawyers go. But you want to make sure that you have the right to assign the contract or have undergo a change of control or sale of the business, and the acquirer gets to assume the contract. Otherwise, you have a situation where the co-man can say no, and then you're stuck because the acquirer, as we talked about earlier, is going to need to use the co-man for a period of time until it could get up and running on its own manufacturing. So you do not want to allow the acquirer to have a blocking right. So you want to always get the ability to assign in the context of a sale of the business.
Yep. We also generally will include prohibit assignment of obligations, so you can't subcontract. All right, term and termination. This one's pretty straightforward. Term can be anything you want it to be, whether it's just a few months or forever. It just depends on what your goals are, what your needs are, and what's going to be most favorable to the relationship. So a shorter term might be good if you only need a relationship with a co-man for a little bit, like a stopgap. A longer term might be favorable if you don't want to have to negotiate an agreement every year or 3 years. A longer term is great if you don't want to have to spend legal dollars to redraft or renegotiate an agreement. It can be not so great if your terms are not so great, because then you have less bargaining power to change those terms. But if you have not so great terms and you only have a 2-year agreement, then guess what? You get to renegotiate and hope for better terms. Termination rights. There's a whole menu of things that you can choose from. We always try to get a termination right for any or no reason. That has to be coupled with a notice period that works for the brand and works for the co-man. It has to be balanced. So oftentimes the consideration there is how long is it going to take you to find a new co-manufacturer, and ramp up to fill whatever your manufacturing needs are. When you terminate the co-manufacturing relationship, other termination rights might be for breach. So somebody does something wrong. That's often a much shorter notice period because you want to get out of the agreement if there is something not right. Force majeure, like we discussed, maybe insolvency or bankruptcy. And then often we'll have a termination of services on a SKU by SKU basis. So you just want to stop making, one particular product, and you'll terminate just for that. Effects of termination might be that you have to purchase back materials, packaging, or you have to pay for the take or pay penalty that we talked about. Take financial responsibility for obligations that you had under the agreement if termination is before the end of your term. Okay, Hillary, back to you.
Okay, somebody in the chat asked about this. So sometimes your co-man doesn't have all the equipment that you need, but they're interested in producing your product and you want to work with them. So many brands, if they have the budget for it or they have the credit for it, will purchase a piece of equipment or a whole line in some cases, and place it with the co-man to use to manufacture the brand's products. This is more common than you would think. There's a lot of things that go into that, like who's going to hold title for it? Is the co-man going to kind of lease to own and purchase it at the end of the relationship? Is the brand going to want to keep it at the end of the relationship? Is the brand going to get a discount off the co-man pricing because it's purchasing the equipment and providing it to the co-man to use? Can the co-man use it for other brands or for its own products, or is it only for the exclusive use of your brand's products? We typically try to allow them to use it for others, but give your line, your orders priority and require them to give you a discount for use by another brand. There's a lot of different ways to structure this. Who's responsible for maintaining the equipment? Who's responsible for repairing it? And that means both arranging for it and paying for it. We've had situations where this type of relationship existed, but then the co-man didn't follow the warranty or the operating manual or all the specs and instructions for the equipment, and then they ended up voiding the warranty, and the brand holds title to the piece of equipment, but then has no recourse against the manufacturer of the equipment because the co-man did something to void the warranty. So we usually include terms about avoiding that particular situation. You want to require them to maintain the crating and shipping for it. If you're going to take it back after termination, it's a lot easier if they're maintaining the crating that it comes in. So there's all sorts of issues like this. If you hold title to it, you're going to want to file what's called a UCC-1 financing statement with the Secretary of State, where the co-man is formed to put the co-man's creditors on notice that that piece of equipment that's sitting there is not the co-man's and is not a piece of collateral for their debts. It is your property. Many brands forget to do this kind of thing. This is something that's important to do.
All right.
So it is possible to do it.
I'm going to have to cut us because we're going to get booted here. Do you mind flipping to the contact page? I think it's 2 slides down. So thank you so much, Foster Garvey. This was a lot of information. Really appreciate that. And there's obviously just so much more. So I'm putting, again, Hillary and Erika's contact info. If there's something we didn't get to or you think you might need their help to get a co-man contract looked at, definitely reach out to them over email. I've put that info here. They also are nice enough to put their phones out here, so I'm sure those will be ringing very soon. So thank you again, Foster Garvey, Hillary, Erika. This was really an epic presentation.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right. Slides will be emailed out, and you'll be able to get the recording on our YouTube page. Bye,
Daniel,
everyone.
can we get a copy of the chat, or is that not available?
Yes, I will. Yeah, let me check with our team.
There's a lot of unanswered questions. I'd just like to see what folks ask.
Okay. All right. Well, yes, we will look into it. Thank you
Okay.
so much, everyone.
Thank you.